All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started. This is Bates Nursery Botanical Bootcamp. I'm Ben Trest, Landscape Specialist at Bates Nursery. Today we're going to be talking about foundation plants. This is definitely a very popular topic. I would say the majority of plants we sell are used for foundation plants, by far. Emerald Green Arborvitae is one of our best sellers. It's used for a screen, but also in front of houses, in front of a foundation. So what we're going to be talking about is basically the plants that you put up against your house. So anything that gives your house curb appeal, usually right in front of the windows, or maybe strategically blocking something. That first set of plants from the house we're going to call foundation plants. And usually this is the first thing folks are looking for whenever they have a new house or a bare landscape. And usually it's the first thing to put in. I usually recommend when planning your landscape or your garden, think of your foundation plants first. That's really going to set the stage for everything else in your garden. It's going to determine how much room you have. So this is the first thing you should do if you're going to be planting in stages. Let this be your first stage, and then you can go from there. The foundation plants are really big for curb appeal, so we'll take a look at basically, what's going to work with your house and help set that off, and also to help raise home value. A ton of people either want to maintain their home value or are looking at selling their house, and this is typically the biggest thing that's going to help that curb appeal and value and resale value. Okay, so first we're going to talk about planning, and that's why I'm sitting down here for the start of this webinar. We're going to kind of do some basic things just to show you all how you can very simply and quickly take a look at how much space you have and how to plan it out. So I do have a little 8.5x11 piece of graph paper in front of me, just because this is something most people can get a hold of. You could do this on a napkin. As long as you can get your ideas down in basic, we can definitely go from there, and that also helps us kind of work with you and see what you have planned. This being said, the first thing you should do is measure your space if you haven't already. So basically, how deep or wide your bed is one direction and how wide your bed is the other direction is a great simple measurement to have. And then that's going to determine how many and what size plants we can put in there. Maybe note windows, doors, things like that we don't want to block on your house and how far those are. And this is really important. So those basic measurements are really going to be what we use to determine everything. And before we get started, I did make a little note for myself here. I do have a couple of webinars coming up here at the end of the month. Landscape design. We'll talk a little bit more about this planning and how you can get that on paper topic, as well as drawing, which is kind of one of my passions. So literally how we can draw that and detail that, and whether it's a hobby or it's something you're seriously looking at redoing a whole landscape. We'll talk about some techniques we can use February 25th and March 4th. Okay, so for the simple drawings, I'm going to talk about 3 ways you can use these foundation plants. So the first one I'm going to talk about is one plant hedge. So the idea is we're going to be using the most basic, so one single plant to make a continuous hedge around your bed. So I'm going to go ahead and just draw basically the wall of a house, and we'll just go ahead and put a pathway in there to give you all a little bit of perspective. So this is bird's eye view, what most people are familiar with whenever looking at a landscape. So from top down, from the airplane, this will be the wall of our house. And this is going to be our front stoop in a doorway. And I'm going to use a Sharpie to make it a little bit clearer for y'all. And this is going to be the wall of our house. Maybe we have a turn, maybe we have a driveway over here. Sidewalk. So we're going to look at this space right here. So this bed right here, if we say this is our bed, if we're looking at one plant, let's say we're using a soft touch holly, for example, and our bed is maybe 10 feet deep. And our bed might be 20 feet wide, just to make up some numbers. So soft touch holly gets about 3 to 4 feet. And if we're going to use that to fill up this space, I'll usually use that spacing for a hedge at the minimum size. So easily those soft touch hollies will get 3 foot across. Let's start with that, because that can make one solid hedge. So if we say 20 feet divided by 3 can kind of tell me how many I'm going to put in that space. We should be able to fit 5, 6, possibly 7. So I'm just going to go ahead and do a rough jotting. Now, if those plants get 3 feet wide, I would love to see them at least 4 feet away from that wall. That way, it's not going to be growing into your foundation, and we'll talk about that later. But if you just want to get an idea of these plants, we're just going to go ahead and put 5 of these in here. And you can do more accurate measurements, but we're just trying to get this on paper. And I'm going to go ahead and draw those overlapping. So here we have a hedge made up of one plant. So soft touch holly, dense yews, which we'll talk about later, as one solid unit. This is kind of the most basic formal foundation design you can use. Very common and very effective. Maybe a little more maintenance than you want, so we'll talk about that later. The second thing I'd like to talk about is using a single plant, so one plant, and spaced. So instead of a hedge, we're going to let these plants kind of stand on their own. So if I'm going to use that same image from above, do I need to scooch this up at all, Tyler?
I think you can scooch it up a little bit. There you go.
So we're going to use this same kind of drawing. So we'll say 20 feet here and 10 feet here. And again, we're going to go into more detail on drawing later this month. So if you have any questions, we'll try to take care of that later. But if we have the same bed, we're going to do less. So if those plants get 3 to 4 foot wide, let's put them at 5 feet so they don't touch and they end up standing on their own, maybe having their own shape. So if I plant those 5 feet apart, we're only going to be able to do 4 in this space, maybe even less. So if I do 1, 2, 3, 4, and those plants are going to stand on their own. Now you can do all sorts of planting in front of this, but just to give you a difference of a hedge and a spaced foundation planting. Now there's one more, little more advanced common foundation planting that we're going to talk about. Is that in the shot, Tyler?
Yep.
Okay. And this one's about a combination of 2 different types of plants. You could put as many as you want. I usually like to keep it simple with 1, 2, maybe 3 different types of plants. So if we're working with the same space, 20 feet and 10 feet with our little stoop. With this, we want to consider windows. A lot of times people want to keep tall plants or different plants from blocking their view. So if we have a window right here, which is kind of hard to see a window from top down, but if we have a window right here, we really don't want anything tall in front of this window. So maybe we could put our taller plants here, and we could put our lower plants here. And you could do them all the same size, but for instance, this could be sky pencil holly, which we'll look at. And then this could also be your soft touch holly. Now these are 2 plants with a similar leaf and similar texture, but one is upright and one is low. Let me go ahead and do a quick example of what that might look like from the road. So if we have our roof here on our house, we're just going to do pretty quick for time's sake. And we have a window here. And this is our bed that we're looking at. A lot of folks would like to do shrubs underneath the window, and then tall upright plants, and these could be sky pencils, they could be emerald green arborvitae on either side of the window to help accentuate the dimensions of the house. So 3 ideas. So 2 different plants used in the foundation planting, 1 plant spaced out apart, and then a single plant hedge. And these are kind of the 3 basics. You can get as fancy and complex as you want, but just to give you all a starting point. So that's about all I'm going to demo with drawing today, just to get y'all started. We're just going to move on to plant selection and options. So I'm going to kind of move over and we'll take a look at those. All right, let me get set up here, y'all.
Now, Ben, what's the best gauge for plant spacing and growth habit and size? Would you say that, I mean, I know we like to help people when they come out to the nursery, but for somebody who doesn't have as much experience identifying the final size that plants get, what do you recommend?
Sure. You know, there's a lot of information out there. Most of our plants have tags. For the most part, those tags are...
Your mic.
Oops, sorry, flipping. These tags are pretty accurate. In my experience, most tags are giving you a 5 to 10 year maturity estimate. So nothing beats actually seeing a plant in the ground for a long time and seeing how big it grows. But for like the basic drawing we just did, soft touch holly, which is down here in the corner, 3 to 4 foot's pretty average. I've seen them bigger, but they've been in the ground for a long time. So I'll go by that tag. 3 to 4 foot is my minimum spacing. You can always go farther apart on plants. So like I said, that dimension on the tag is a good way to get an idea of whether your plants are going to be touching or they're going to be independent of each other. And again, you can find multiple sources. You can Google a plant online and find a range of sizes. Usually they could be as much as 30 to 50% different for the same plant. So you do have to take some of the tags lightly, but typically we're looking at a 5 to 10 year growth habit for that full size for the tags. Then again, you can prune plants. So if you are thinking of having them sheared, more formal shaped, you can determine the size of those plants. But yeah, for the most part, on the tag is a great way to go. That's kind of our starting point. You know, if you come into Bates Nursery, we can use our own experience in what we have actually seen in the landscape. So feel free to pick our brains about how this plant may get a little bit different than what you think. Okay, we're going to go into selecting plants for foundation. I have a slew of plants up here. As what we mostly recommend for landscapes, the sun exposure is probably the #1 way to determine what your plants are going to be. So if you come out, the first thing we're going to ask you is, you know, how much sun is there? Is it sunny? Is it shady? Is it a little bit of both? And first I'm going to look at full sun plants. This is the most common selection. Now some of these can take some shade and we'll talk about that. But we'll look at low plants, so under the window foundation plants, ones you want probably waist height and lower, and then upright tall plants, so ones that are really going to grow tall left and right of the window. So low hedge plants, one of my personal favorites for a sunny, dry location is juniper. Now this is mint julep. This is a small guy, 1 gallon right now. This would be a great way to start a hedge because you can plant them closer and get a quicker hedge. And referring to that tag question, or the size question, you know, this says 4 to 6 feet tall, 6 to 8 feet wide. I would say that's pretty accurate. And they give us that range because you could easily keep this under the window with a shearing once a year. If you don't want maintenance and you want this to be more of a loose habit, kind of like they show in the tag, I'd be planting these 6 feet apart so that they can be independent of each other. So this is juniper, can take a lot of sun, a lot of heat, but can also take trimming and shearing very well. So if you want more of a manicured shaped look to your landscape, juniper is a great choice for sun. I believe I have 2 of them here. So you can get an idea of, I mean, these are small and these are very close, but you can start planting these next to each other and they'll grow and you can form a hedge. You know, if these were 3-4 feet apart, they're going to hedge. If you plant these 6-7 feet apart, they'll probably be their own plant.
Just adding to that, sure. We do have in our webinar archive a session on demystifying plant tags, which I believe Justin Morris did. Just learning how to read the tags because we have lots of different growers out here, and so it just helps you identify like the right needs for the right situation you have.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, you know, we'll carry plants from different distributors and different growers. Sometimes they will have the same plant in a different dimension. So it's nice to be able to know how you're reading the tag, and that's a great webinar to watch. The second sun foundation plant, this is a pretty common one for good reason. This can take a lot of heat, a lot of sun, even a little bit of shade. This is Nandina. Now this is a variety called Gulfstream, which is a dwarf variety of Nandina. Other than the straight species Nandina domestica, most of them stay under 4 feet. So we have a ton of varieties, probably as much as a dozen different varieties of Nandina. Most all of these will be between 1 foot and 4 foot, so a great choice to put in front of your windows, in front of your house. Gulfstream, I believe is going to say 3 to 3.5 feet, which is about right. I really like the texture of Nandina. I think they do great standing on their own, kind of having a nice fluffy bamboo texture. Evergreen, and in fact all the plants we're going to talk about today are evergreen. You know, if you want to do plants that lose their leaves, there's definitely some options. It's a little less traditional, but you know, let us know if you want to kind of think out of the box there. But Nandina domestica, great one. I would probably plant these at 2 foot for a solid hedge, 3 to 4 feet for independent planting. Firepower is probably the most recognizable one of these, so y'all might be familiar with that one.
And if you have any questions, feel free to enter them into the chat. We can answer them as we go along.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're going to cover a lot of different plant types.
And you might save me a little time getting to something we're going to get onto later. So we're going to look at yew. Now this is the species Taxus. There's a couple of yews up here. This is the more sun-loving one. And this is a Hicks yew. So when we're talking about an upright columnar plant, and I'll see if I have a tag here. It's actually a pretty good picture of a Hicks yew here. A Hicks yew is going to be your vertical element. Let me see if I have my horizontal yew. Actually, that's going to be right here. So down in front of the box, this is a dense spreading yew. Same species. This one's going to go 2 to 4 feet wide, 6 to 8 feet tall is pretty common. The dense yew is going to be more like 4 to 6 feet tall and wide. So same texture. You could easily plant these around windows and then plant the dense yew underneath your windows. Now, a word of caution, dense yews are great, tough, hardy plants. They can get bigger than some people think. So if you don't want anything bigger than 4 feet and you don't want to trim, it may not be a good choice. However, you can cut a couple feet off it every year and keep it below your windows. So this is Taxus. Hicks yew and dense yew, very, very common foundation plants and very tolerant and tough in full sun or even part shade. Let's see what else we have here. I do have some arborvitae, and in fact I believe I have a couple behind the table. So we have a couple of ball-shaped arborvitae. This is Hetz midget. Which should be a 3 to 4 foot. Yeah, that's what the tag's saying. So Hetz midget, and I believe this is golden globe. There's a couple other varieties of globe-shaped arborvitae in different colors. So you can really do a color combo. We do also have the emerald green arborvitae. So there's a bunch of them. The key with arborvitae is give it sun. They really don't like shady locations. So if you have a lot of sun, Arborvitae is a great choice. The emerald green arborvitae on the corner of the table is our #1 seller at Bates Nursery. I mean, for landscape plants, we sell more of this than anything else, just because it fits a lot of people's spaces. So 4 feet wide, 8 feet tall. A lot of folks will make a living fence with these. However, if you put them on the corners of your foundation or beside your windows, it really adds a lot of scale to your house, and really giving it a more diverse look instead of just a hedge. So arborvitae, great plants. You can trim arborvitae, but I think they look a little better left alone. Again, there's many varieties and shades of, this is actually going to turn green in the spring. You can see the green on the inside. They'll bronze in the winter, giving you a little bit of color change, and then they'll brighten up in the spring. So arborvitae, kind of, can't do without it in our landscape nowadays. It's a good plant.
Ben, we got a question from James. Can you also mention which plants are native and which ones aren't?
Sure, and I will be honest here. Whenever I put the plants together today, there really are no truly plants that I would say true natives. Most of our native plants are deciduous. There are a few evergreens, but they don't really make good foundation plants. So this is something that's become a growing passion for people, and there's been a growing demand for these plants. So really not a lot of natives up here. Now, none of these are invasive plants, so none of these are going to invade. You know, a few that I can think off the top of my head are Clethra and Itea. Those are two great white flowering deciduous shrubs. Now, a lot of those are still in their bright red fall color right now, so not truly an evergreen, but these are two shrubs you could put under your windows that are natives.
What about American holly?
Most American holly
They
get
really big?
30 to 60 feet tall, one of the biggest hollies. So you could do it as a foundation plant. You probably need to plant them about 15 feet away from your house. So
Loose term foundation.
yeah,
for that
loose
one.
term. You know, obviously, there are some big houses in Middle Tennessee. If you have a very large square footage house, bigger plants make sense. Magnolia, that's another example of a native plant. So evergreen magnolias, our smallest ones get about 20 to 30 feet. I see those in front of houses all the time, and they look really nice. That's not my preferred location, but if you put them 8 feet from the house, you shouldn't have any problems. So
Now we do carry some Espalier magnolia. Do
you
think
can
that
do
those
Espalier, yeah, and that's kind of breaking out of the typical mold. We don't sell a ton of those, but yeah, Espalier is on a fence, which, you know, I could have brought some of those in here today, but on a fence. You can put that up against your house. Camellia is one. Now those are not truly native. Camellia you could put up on a fence. So yeah, and that's something that I think as there's more demand, we'll see more of. If I think of any through this talk, I will definitely let you know. We have euonymus. Now this is not the native euonymus. And the native euonymus, you might be able to use in front of your house as a foundation. It's usually a woodland plant. So yeah, great idea. If I think of any that are truly native during this talk, I'll let you know. And yeah, foundation plants tend to be evergreen. That's a real tough one for native plants. Ferns, you know, if you really have a shade garden, you want to think out of the box, ferns are a great native plant that you can put in there. Some of them can get 3 to 4 feet tall and wide. Okay, where next? Autoleucon. So this is probably one of the most popular foundation shrubs. And I'll go ahead and plop this one up here because it's kind of hard to see down here. Ooh.
Oh,
Oh, we've lost our pot, but you can see our nice soil here. This is a Monrovia plant, even though we don't have the pot. This is Chestnut Hill Laurel, so this is a newer variety. Autoleucon and skip laurel are the other two that are most common. Now, all these laurels have different height ranges. And the reason I really want to talk about laurel is because which one you choose really depends on the height of your windows, the height of your house. So Chestnut Hill, this is bred to be a little bit tighter, a little bit shorter, like 3 to 4 feet, maybe even lower, maybe even 2 feet. And it's also bred to be a little more disease resistant, so it doesn't get shot hole fungus as bad, which is pretty typical of these. That's Chestnut Hill. Autolucan is a substitute for this. So Autolucan is probably the #1 selling laurel. That's a 3 to 4 foot, so under your windows. And then skip cherry laurels. Those will get 6 to 10 feet, maybe even up to 12 feet. So those are something you do not want to put under your window unless it's up about 6 feet. Those can even make a good screen. So laurel, Chestnut Hill, Autolucan, and skip laurel. Again, these are very common for the landscape. Full sun to part shade, I really don't prefer these in full shade. They can get a little bit leggy and they can drop some leaves, and the shot hole fungus can kind of get to be a little bit of a problem in the shade. Let's see if we can plop her in there. And I did mention euonymus when we were talking about natives. This is golden euonymus. This is something that's been planted as foundation plants for a very long time. Whether you like it, whether you don't like it, it's one of the few really bright yellow broadleaf evergreens. Now this is one of those plants, I've seen them 4 feet tall, I've seen them 8, 10 feet tall. So you can definitely plant this as a hedge, but do be cognizant of whether you want to trim this plant or you want it to just grow on its own. I'd say majority of euonymus is trimmed or hedged or shaped in some way. There's other varieties like Silver King that has a nice subdued silver foliage to it, and so that can be nice depending on the color of your house, which we'll talk about later. So euonymus, that's another great evergreen. Again, we do have a native euonymus, probably not the greatest foundation plant. Down here we have some holly. So holly is a great diverse foundation plant. Probably one of the easiest ones to just throw in and forget about it. Soft touch holly, so this is a Japanese holly. These have a smaller leaf. There's no prickers on them, so you know the typical stigma with pokey hollies, the soft touch. And then the sky pencil holly, another very popular one for small tight beds. These are both pretty tight and dwarf, so the soft touch 3 to 4 feet is common. The sky pencil could probably get 6 to 8 feet tall, but only about a foot or two wide. So very tight, good if you have a very narrow bed that doesn't have a lot of depth to it. A great choice, or if you want to put pots in your bed instead of planting them in the ground, you could throw that in a pot on either side of the door. I do have a couple more hollies behind the table. So this is one that's become real popular. This is Red Beauty. And I'm going to kind of cram the table up here. And this is Burford, so this is probably one of the more common holly varieties. And these are broadleaf hollies with prickers on them. So they do have points. But this would be an example of a hedge type holly. And this would be an example of an upright type holly. So you could easily combine these in the landscape to make one cohesive bed with verticals and horizontals. Red Beauty gets, I believe, about 4 to 5 feet wide and about 5 to 7 feet tall, so a nice single-story plant. And the Burford holly has a huge range, like 4 to 10 feet. So this is one of those plants that you can use in a variety of locations. However, if you do not want to maintain or trim a plant, do be wary. You know, these can get big. I think they're beautiful. They put red berries on. But if you're not able to get out there and prune them every year or two, they can definitely get out of control. And eventually I've seen a lot of these ripped out of foundations. Hollies, if planted too close, can have very vigorous root systems. You may even have to cut them out of the ground, which is unfortunate, but it happens a lot. So Burford holly, Red Beauty holly, there's a ton of other hollies for foundations. Needlepoint holly is very popular, very similar to Burford. And these tend to be pretty affordable plants. So when we're talking about budget and cost, hollies are going to be near the bottom of the cost range. So very cost effective, very popular for selling houses and contractors, and even in your typical landscape. I mean, there's beautiful plants.
Ben, do you still think that these hollies would provide like shelter for woodland?
Oh, absolutely.
Birds?
Absolutely. And when I'm talking about wildlife and shelter, a dense branching habit and nice firm branches is what I look for. You know, critters could hide in here. A bird could build a nest in here. And all of these more broadleaf hollies with the prickers, they will produce berries. So you've kind of got a twofold effect for wildlife. Again, that density is what I look for. Most of these would be good for wildlife. You know, Nandina we talked about, and juniper, maybe not great for habitat or for living animals, but the rest of these are pretty good. Yew maybe not such a good one either, but holly definitely a great one for wildlife. And speaking of good for wildlife, deer typically won't eat these, so these will be a good habitat, but not a good, basically not a good buffet for deer, which is a huge problem in parts of Tennessee. So holly, probably one of my favorites for foundations. And I've got a couple more obscure sun foundation plants back here. This is mugo pine. This would be a little bit less common, a little bit higher cost of a plant because they grow slower. But if you're going for more of a modern or a desert style landscape, this really fits in there. Oriental or Japanese landscapes, a mugo pine is an awesome choice. This is one of those plants that you will see on the tag. Let me see what they even say on the tag. 3 to 5 foot tall, 6 to 10 feet in 10 years. I think they're a little slower than that, but typically I see them about 4 by 4. Essentially, if this grows for 15 years, it could get 10 feet tall. So do be considerate of time frame and how fast this plant grows. Again, that is mugo pine. Really nice for a different texture, and it gets these neat little candles on it. Let's see what else I have. That's probably one of our bigger ones. So I did want to mention azalea, and also earlier the question about natives. There are native azaleas out there, so that might be a good option. Most of our native azaleas do lose their leaves in the winter, so that's a consideration. But let's see if I can find you the tag. This is actually a new Encore azalea introduction for us this year, which we'll be having a webinar about new plants here soon. This is Autumn Starburst. Encore azaleas are a great option for folks who want evergreen and they want flowers and they just want something that's kind of easy to maintain. This kind of checks all the boxes for folks. So Encore azaleas, the whole lot of them will bloom spring, they'll bloom fall, and they'll be a little more evergreen than other azaleas. Now, I prefer these in full sun. They can take a little bit of shade, but a great option. Most of these will be between 3 to 5 feet, so you can really use these as any foundation plant. You can trim them, you can let them go natural. So Encore azaleas, great option. You know, you could stick this on the corners of your house and it's really going to just draw that pop of color in. Or you could use it as a hedge. So great option, Encore azalea. A ton of colors, a ton of options on these, and pretty well priced. And I'm kind of getting down towards the end of our sun plants, and I'm going to kind of go into more shade tolerant. Again, a lot of these will do both. Boxwood. So we'll probably have to take a minute and talk about boxwood because I think this is probably one of the most recognized and most used landscape plants for foundations and hedges, and for a good reason. I mean, they are a tough, tolerant plant. For the most part, in Middle Tennessee, we don't get many disease issues, much blight issue with boxwood. So, and all of our plants come treated for disease and things like that. But boxwood can take full sun, it can take part shade, you can leave them loose, you can shear them, you can hedge them. A very versatile foundation plant.
Slower growing too, right?
What's that?
Slower growing too.
A little slower growing. Sometimes I am surprised. I've seen some boxwood grow a foot a year. So just depending on your soil conditions. But yeah, they're not going to get out of hand. There are some miniature boxwoods that don't get big at all. But I wanted to give y'all a sense of a couple of different options here and different heights. So these are green velvet. Probably one of the most popular recently in boxwood. It's like a 3 to 4 foot rounded shrub. Now these are smaller and they've been sheared, but if you see these in the ground left alone, they'll be a perfect little ball, 3 to 4 feet. This picture shows it as a hedge, so you can do either one of these. If you plant them about 2 to 3 feet apart, you'll have a nice green hedge. If you plant them 5 feet apart, you're going to have these nice rounded boxwood. And in the middle here I have Green Mountain. There's also other ones like Green Tower, D-Runk, which is a vertical growing boxwood. So without you having to shape it, this is naturally going to grow upright. So I could see you doing, let's say if we had a window here that I'm looking out, and then the window ends here, we could put this to the right of our window and have a nice little evergreen hedge under the window to look out of. So boxwood, super easy, super versatile. Some of these will actually get bronzing in the winter. So this kind of yellow coppery tone is actually a part of its winter color. So you do get some diversity in boxwood. Again, super easy to maintain, medium slow growth. And these will take full sun to part shades. So, you know, we may get a little bit bored of boxwoods and landscape, but I think there's a place in everyone's foundation planting for at least consideration of boxwoods. So, and feel free to come ask us about varieties. There are a ton out there. Okay, I've got one more sun plant. So this is Distilium. This is kind of, it's been growing on me over the past few years. So Distilium is one that is full sun to part shade and maybe not quite deep shade, but 3 hours of sun a day would be good. So Distilium is a nice open vase-shaped evergreen. So if you want more of a looser, naturalized look, Distilium is a great option. I believe this one's Cinnamon Girl. And these are 2 to 3 feet tall, 3 to 4 foot wide, so you can get a lot of width out of this. But at 2 to 3 feet tall, that is just barely going to graze most people's window heights. So nice thing to look out on. It's got a dense branching habit, glossy green leaves. It does bloom, but it's not super showy. Great substitute for laurel. You know, if you've tried laurel and you've had issues with them or you have fungal problems, Distilium is a different species, so it doesn't have the same potential issues. You can shear these. I've seen these shaped, but I really like them for this unique open vase shape. Sometimes substitute for privet, which we do not sell anymore, ligustrum. Similar texture, similar look. We've gotten one last year called Linebacker Distilium, and those get 8 to 10 feet tall and wide. So if you like this texture, we make one that gets about single story, nice big shrub size that you could put on the corner of your house as well. So Distilium, a great option for sun or shade foundation plantings if you want kind of a looser look.
We have a question. Ashley's asking, is Distilium fast growing?
Oh yes, yeah. Distilium, I would equate it with holly as far as speeds. So 1 foot, maybe 2 feet a year. Most of that growth tends to be horizontal on them, but they'll kind of grow out of the center and do a fountain shape. But yeah, pretty quick. I would expect 1 foot to 2 feet a year out of them, especially once established. Again, the low ones are probably going to put out center growth and then go more horizontal, but pretty vigorous, similar to holly.
Lisa on Facebook also is saying her boxwood plants are quite old, 25 plus years. Pretty much only stems on the interior and green on the outside, but she's She's saying they're a little too big, but she's afraid to cut them back because of the bare stems inside. Yeah. Is there any? Do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, and that's tough. You know, that gets into, you know, if we put a plant somewhere and it just gets too big for that space and we're not able to trim it continually, it can get a little leggy, and this is a pretty common problem. Hollies have that too. Short answer is yes, you can trim it. The bad news is it's probably going to look a little bit rough for a few years. So you can find all different skill levels of people who can prune boxwoods. You can do it yourself. But what I would do is call a core pruning or reduction pruning on a large boxwood. And we might be able to do a webinar in the future on some of those kind of more advanced pruning techniques. But if your boxwood has leaves out here and it's all stems in the middle, it can grow back from the center, but you have to take it down. And it's going to have a year or two where it's going to look like a bunch of sticks, as people say it, and it's going to have to flush. So you're going to have to do a hard reduction or clip out some of those big branches to allow that plant to grow back from the center. Again, there's different techniques you can use, but you're probably going to look at it basically looking a little bit rough for a season or two.
And we also have a question from Diane here. Does mock orange make a good foundation plant if the space is large, like 7 by 7 at least?
Yeah, right. So mock orange, it can get a little bit on the larger side as far as the dimensions. It's kind of a looser plant. Mock orange isn't really an evergreen, so I would mix it with other plantings. So mock orange, I could see you pulling it out a little bit from the foundation and then maybe putting evergreens around it or beside it to kind of give it a little bit of a green canvas to bounce off of. But you know, a very profuse flowering plant, typically mock orange I see planted more for habitat or more wild plantings, not as much foundation plantings, but I don't see why not. I mean, you could even trim a mock orange. I'm sure you could shear it and get it to shape whatever you want. But yeah, I mean, absolutely. And the statement about, you know, 7 by 7 bed, it should be a bigger bed. If you have a 2 foot deep bed, mock orange is going to become a problem pretty quickly. Okay, let me see. We talked about Distilium. Let's talk about yew. We talked about Taxus yew, so sun-loving yew. I do have a few Cephalotaxus here. So this is a Japanese yew. A lot of folks are familiar with plum yew. That's the same species. Now these do really well in shade. So this is an upright plum yew. So Cephalotaxus, this is fastigiata, which just means upright. And this is, I believe, a Duke Gardens, which is going to be more of a hedge type plum yew. So just two options of plum yew. These are very similar texture to our Taxus yew, but slower growing and very shade tolerant. Great if you want that kind of needled evergreen texture like that pine that I have back here. Similar texture, but this pine will not take the shade. These will just thrive in it. In fact, I wouldn't really put them in full sun. You might burn them. So plum yew is the one I don't have here. Plum yew literally hangs out on the ground, 1 to 2 feet tall, 4 to 5 feet wide. The plum yew, you know, the biggest ones I really see in the landscape are about 6 feet tall, 2 feet wide. And the Duke Gardens is like a square plant, so like 3 by 4. Great substitute for a holly or a boxwood if you just want to add some texture. And as you can see, this has been sheared. You can easily shear and shape them. You can leave them kind of natural if you'd like. So that's Japanese yew, Cephalotaxus. And then that's really, we talked about some crossover plants. So that's the only one that's really going to be deep shade loving. The hollies you could put in partial shade. The euonymus you could put in shade. Laurels, you know, they'll do okay in part shade. Nandina actually surprisingly can tolerate some shade. But if it's too wet, or you're expecting a tight formal plant, this may not work for the shade. Trying to think if there's any more. Oh, a Cuba. How could I forget a Cuba? So this is Mr. Gold Strike. Gold Dust is another common variety. So a Cuba is probably one of the most shade tolerant plants that we sell. I mean, these could grow in probably 1 or 2 hours of sun a day. Don't want to put them in sun, but for the shade garden, this is an evergreen that really can draw some light into that area. This is an oriental plant, so you do kind of get that oriental Japanese look. The only thing to consider with a Cuba is they're slow growing, but I have seen them upwards of 6 feet at maturity. So if you don't want to trim it all, then in the long term this may get too big. But then again, they're pretty slow, probably 6 inches to a foot a year. Really neat plant. They kind of have a tropical look, so if you want that kind of tropical look in the shade, great option. There's also green leaf varieties that put on berries. So a Cuba, great plant for the shade. I'm not even sure what they're going to say. 4 to 6 feet tall, 4 to 5 feet wide on these, but again, slow, which is typical of most things in the shade. And the other things we've talked about that'll do well as a foundation plant on the shadier side of the house. The boxwood can tolerate it, part shade. The hollies are very versatile. They'll take 3 hours of sun a day. The laurels, the nandina, even the azalea. Now I did mention the encore azalea. There are other azaleas that'll do better in shades. So there's Pucanense azaleas, gumpos, there's a ton of them out there. Rhododendron, we didn't really talk about rhododendron. That's a less common plant, but rhododendron, if you're looking for a foundation native plant, rhododendron's a good one, and I really don't recommend it away from the house. So, if you're looking for that big pop of color, that little more native-esque garden, you might consider a rhododendron. Again, they're a little cold sensitive, so putting them up against your house, up against the foundation, maybe in a big corner up against your house is a great place to put a rhododendron. They prefer well-drained soil, so that is one native that I would recommend. I don't have it in here, but there's a plant called Elysium, or I believe it's called anise flower. That is a native, and it's specifically native a little further south. But I have one in my garden called Banana Appeal, which is like pure yellow. It's yellower than even this euonymus down here. And again, that's Elysium, Illiccium. That would be a native plant. It really is the only thing yellow in my shade garden. So it just draws you back to that place, or if you have a foundation that's shady, it's going to draw your eye into that garden bed. So Elysium would be a great native option. Try to think. Mountain laurel is a little more on the edge of hardiness here, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend mountain laurel for a foundation plant. We talked about Pieris in my last talk, which is a slow grower, but you could do Pieris as a foundation plant. They're not so fast and not as vigorous, so don't expect a quick growth and establishment out of them. I did write down a few more considerations, just a kind of side note, other than the plants. So house color. Some people talk to me about the paint job on their house, or if they're going to repaint them, or the brick color. These are great things to consider. If you have a red brick house, you may not want to put, trying to think of what would be conflicting, Nandina. If we get some more red Nandinas up against a red brick house, you might get lost a little bit. So we might do something contrasting, like, a more yellow tone plant against a red brick house, or even a nice light green boxwood to kind of set that off. And vice versa, if you have a light colored house, so if it's white or a bright color. You might go more with like a subdued green color, like a juniper, an arborvitae, or a yew is really going to kind of tone down that color. You can always add maybe some flowers in there the same color as the house to really set that paint job off. The other note is style. So, this is a little more persnickety for beds, but if you have an idea of style, so we're talking formal versus contemporary versus natural, what do you want it to look like? Do you have a ultra modern house that's got a lot of square lines? Then you might go for something that's a little bit different, a little more shapely or architectural, like Mugo pine. But if you have a red brick house with white columns, you might go more formal and traditional, like boxwood. So, picking something that fits the style of your house is something, just another level of consideration. And then, as we've kind of mentioned throughout here, is maintenance. A lot of folks come to me and say, I don't want to ever have to trim it or touch it. Picking the right plant that's going to get to be the right size for your bed, and then planting them like we talked at the beginning with the drawing, spacing them out far enough to let them grow to maturity without touching. This is a good way to avoid maintenance. Now, if you love to trim and love to work, then hedges are a great way to get into gardening and shaping. So consider maintenance when you're picking your foundation plants.
We have a question from Paula. Do you recommend loropetalum? And let's kind of expand upon that too, because there are some that have like kind of a more magenta or purple foliage, right?
Yeah, I didn't think about loropetalum. That's a great option, and I think we're probably waiting on our big shipment in the spring to get some fresh ones. Loropetalum is one of the only purple leaf plants that's really going to keep that leaf through the winter. So it's very popular. It'll tend to have a frilly, bright colored, either like purple, red, or pink colored bloom. And that's typically going to be while it's cold outside. So loropetalum, really popular option. The only thing to consider on loropetalum is cold hardiness. So we're right on the edge of their cold hardiness. So put them up against your foundation is really an ideal spot. Just in my experience, the ones that stay lower to the ground seem to take the frost harder. The ones that grow a little bit bigger and a little more hedge-like tend to take the freezes a little bit better. But yeah, loropetalum, super popular. There's no other real purple leaf option out there. So yeah, absolutely. If you want to add some color, loropetalum is a great option.
I guess certain species of Japanese maple might also work too, if you're fine with deciduous plants.
Yeah, and Japanese maple, I didn't include it today because, with foundation plants, I really think of something that is going to create a canvas for a house. Usually the Japanese maple is the center of attention and it wants to basically be on the canvas. So a lot of times I'll take that Japanese maple and pull it out from the foundation and let it kind of sit out in that bed so you can really focus on it. But if you've got a Japanese maple and you've got a hedge of Duke Gardens yews behind it, it's just going to make the color and the pop of that Japanese maple even brighter. So yeah, absolutely. Japanese maples are a little bit higher cost plants, so doing a hedge of Japanese maples is not something I get a lot of questions for. But yeah, Japanese maple, one or two in your bed pulled out from the foundation, super great option.
And I imagine in your landscape design webinar, you can go a little bit deeper because, foundation is like kind of closer to the home. But, let's say you can't quite get that native combo in your foundations, but, you could add another layer in front of native perennial flowers if you wanted to, right?
And we haven't really talked about mixing deciduous plants and evergreens. I even thought about getting a red twig dogwood in here. It's not a super popular plant for foundation, but if you have a bunch of broadleaf evergreens, say a laurel or a holly, in front of your house, you could create a gap and put a red leaf dogwood in there, and you're basically going to have these bright red stems on the foundation of your house in the winter, so you get this kind of juxtaposition in the season. So there are some options with like deciduous plants, which we really didn't talk about, where you can kind of put one or two in that foundation to kind of give you a sense of seasonal change.
Yeah. We have a question from Kobe. Do you recommend fertilizing existing boxwoods? And if so, what do you use? And let's also double it up. Peggy is asking best time to prune boxwoods and hollies.
Yeah, boxwoods, hollies, and I'm really going to treat them as the same as far as fertilizing and maintenance. I mean, really with boxwoods, hollies, I'm going to use an evergreen fertilizer. Holly tone is kind of the one that I choose because it's just easy, it works. I usually get a response out of it in the spring. That's really going to help with like yellowing or discoloration or, you know, infertility or slow, basically slow growth, or, you know, just basically soil that's starting to go depleted. You could do compost on these, but something as simple as a holly tone evergreen fertilizer is what I would recommend. And as far as pruning, the problem we get into with pruning boxwood and holly coming here soon, because spring is coming, is if you prune it and then we get excessive growth because we're fertilizing too early, and we get a frost in April, a lot of that new foliage could be damaged. So, you know, we're probably starting to get a little late for pruning those. I would wait until late April or after our final frost of the season to prune. Because like I said, what we're worried about is fertilizing, pruning, getting that fresh, tender new growth, and all of that getting burned by frost. So wait till basically our last chance of frost moves through, typically late April, and then prune your plants while it's still cool out is a good idea. Again, that's with holly and with boxwood. Both of those are tender with new growth. I would fertilize at the same time as I prune. So fertilize late April. I mean, you could totally have fertilized and pruned in January, maybe right now early February, but we're starting to get into the kind of danger zone for pruning.
Yeah, I think I read online when I was looking to prune my hollies between Memorial Day and the 4th of July.
Yeah, and I mean, you can prune in the summer too. That's not really a problem. It's really that frost in the spring and in the fall that we kind of get a little bit leery of. And I'm done with my talking points, so whatever questions y'all have.
Well, we have one more question
Okay.
from Sydney. What about initial planting amendments? So let's go back before we get the plants in the ground. Do you recommend a general biotone type product to help establish roots, or does it more depend on the species needs? And let's, you know, maybe an earth mix product might fit the bill too here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Biotone's a great product. You know, as far as the soil amendment and the different species of plant, it's not that big of a deal. I just about assume most of our soils can have heavy clay in them. So my instructions for amending are pretty much the same. Biotone, if you really want to get the quickest establishment and the quickest growth out of your plant, Biotone is just going to be extra. It's really just going to help it set roots fast and just get to that growth rate that you want quicker. But generally for planting any hardwood, shrubs, trees, I recommend our landscape mix. Soil conditioner, we make that in-house here, an earth mix product. That's basically got a mixture of bark and a mixture of organic soil, so compost, and that mixture mixed with soil, so conditioned, is going to allow your soil to drain and add a little bit of organic matter to feed that plant. Generally, our rule of thumb is, let me see if I can find a 3-gallon plant up here. Here's a 3-gallon arborvitae. So our landscape mix, our soil conditioner, we'll do about 3 of these. So if you're planting 3 of these in a hedge, you get 1 bag of that soil conditioner. The soil that you dig out of the hole, you mix with that conditioner is the best thing you can do. I wouldn't add just garden soil or just topsoil to the hole, because that plant has to get used to what you're growing it in. So now if you're going to do that and you're going to use biotone, put that biotone in that mix when you plant it. That biotone really works best in the ground with the plant. But yeah, landscape mix, and like I said, it does have organic matter. You don't necessarily need to fertilize on top of that. So about the only consideration is if you have a plant that does not like wet feet. I do have a very good example that I showed y'all. So azalea, very notorious for not liking heavy soils and not liking wet feet. You know, if you're planting azalea in a very dense location, you could use basically like a pine fine mulch as your conditioner, which doesn't have organic matter, but it's going to break up heavy soil and lighten it. And then you could biotone and fertilize on top. So, you know, if you have a water sensitive plant with very fine roots, you might consider using a lighter product to amend your soil.
And soil amending is really important, especially for new home sites that are heavily compacted and usually are devoid of nutritious topsoil, and you're dealing with clay that essentially has no breathing room. Yep. What you do with that is introduce that space for the roots to grow, water retention and drainage, and I think it's very important.
Yeah, and I mean compaction is a very common issue I see. If you're lucky enough to have a house that's had landscape and gardens for 50 years, you probably don't have this issue. But if you're in a new neighborhood, new construction, a lot of times that soil has just been compacted over and over. And using a soil conditioner is, I mean, almost 100% necessary for that condition. But the clay in the ground is actually good for the plants. You just need to break it up for them. So yeah, landscape soil conditioner, or like I said, in the worst case scenario, if your plant needs really light, dry roots, you could use a pine fines mulch as a soil conditioner. Yeah, super big thing to do here in Middle Tennessee. Definitely recommend it.
Speaking of soil and soil conditioning, tomorrow, Justin Morris will be talking all about soil and mulch. So that's going to be an important one to tune into as we get into this season of amending your soil, making sure that you match the right amendment or the right type of thing you want to do, you know, versus putting a shrub in the hole in the ground versus building a raised bed. Tune into that tomorrow at 12 p.m. Also, starting off next week, Rain Gardens 101. Terry Kevlin's going to be teaching that one. Disease and treatment products, February 10th. So we're kind of going into spring. We're thinking about topics that we're all going to be doing as we lead up into this busier time of year in the garden.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we have a new plant talk too, which is that's kind of gets us all excited. I can't remember the date of that.
I think that's closer into March. Let's see.
But you know, as we're getting excited, I mean, spring is on the way.
March 10th.
Yeah, there's new plants
plant
coming
varieties.
out. March 10th. So join us for that. I believe we're going to have Representative Brent from Monrovia to come in and really firsthand show us some of those plants. So definitely tune into that one.
Yes, for sure. So stick with us if you want to keep up with Botanical Bootcamp updates. If you go to our website and then click on blog, if you go to our website and scroll down to the tile that says register now, you can sign up to our newsletter. We'll send you a monthly kind of like, here's what's happening. And then any boot camp that you sign up to, we'll send you reminders for. We have an archive as well. On our website, you click blog, go down to Bates Nursery Botanical Bootcamp webinar archive. We have a lot of stuff there. And as always, we're also open to suggestions and comments for future webinars.
Absolutely.
So if there's something that we didn't quite cover, just send us an email, info@batesnursery.com, and we'll work to get that scheduled in.
Yeah, we love having your opinions on what you want to hear about, because that's what we want to talk about is what everyone wants to know.
Yep. Well, I guess that about wraps it up today.
Yep. Thank y'all, everyone, for tuning in. Again, Ben with Bates Nursery, and until next time, see y'all later.